Hello everyone, how you doing? This is Coach Fleischer. It's Kinesiology 214, Module 2, Week 3, also known as Week 6 in the course overall. And for this presentation, specifically we're talking about aerobic versus anaerobic and strength versus power in training. Now, the first thing you really have to kind of wrap yourself around, excuse me, is this basic continuum up here. And it's one that's been around for a number of years, right? And you look at it, it's pretty self-evident. On one side, you have a sport event of shorter duration, 100 meters, jumping, Olympic weightlifting, more explosive type activities. On the right-hand side, you have longer distance, like distance runners, 10,000 meter. And you have this continuum that runs underneath. And this continuum represents the duration of activity for a particular sport. Meaning times. You got 10 seconds, 45 seconds, 90 seconds, 20 minutes or more, and the number of reps that would correspond in an actual strength training workout. And it's kind of intuitive and it makes sense. You know, when you look at this, you go, well, if I look at an Olympic weightlifter and I compare that person with a distance runner, their somatotype, their body type is vastly different. And I wouldn't ask my Olympic weightlifters to go out and run a 10K, and I certainly wouldn't ask my people who do 10Ks to go out and try to bang and hang and do a bunch of heavy power cleans and snatch movement. It's counterintuitive. And so that really simplistic view is one that you kind of have to hold near and dear when you talk about training for athletics, but also training for your clients as well. You know, we know that most sports, all sports, would fall in this continuum from one side to the other, you know, and realistically, most activities of daily living do not. So you're going to have clients who want to create change in their lives, people who want to come in and do different things working out wise. Some might want to do more Olympic weightlifting, others might be looking to do a triathlon. You can kind of peg them somewhere on this continuum to figure out what the heck you want to do. Now, your goal is you can move back and forth within a range on this continuum and use it to your advantage to kind of, you know, minimize the effects of overtraining, change of rep and set combinations, to elicit a training response, but not injure your clients, which is really what the definition of periodization is. You want to reduce boredom, maximize results, and reduce the possibility for injury. And that's within reason, right? Because you know you're never going to take your Olympic weightlifters on a 10K and vice versa. So as we go through this presentation today, I hope more of this makes sense, and we'll revisit this at the end. I always love to give the example of the sprinter and the couch spud. And if you think of like watching the Olympics and you have this guy who's a couch spud who's watching the 100-meter sprint on the Olympics. And he's watching this individual who's about ready to dial up and do a 100-meter sprint. And while the couch spud is sitting there, he's burning predominantly fat as an energy source. And he's mostly operating in an aerobic capacity. That's not to say he's up and working aerobically, but it's just that's the predominant energy system at work. Now, the sprinter on TV, he's actually going more anaerobic, and he's using glycogen as a predominant energy source as opposed to the couch spud who's using fat. So evaluating this kind of aerobic versus anaerobically, you can kind of see on the left-hand side with anaerobic, the fat to carbohydrate breakdown, right? So you have fat burn, this is carbohydrate burn, and over here the fat burn and the carbohydrate burn are completely the opposite. So on the aerobic side, it's definitely more carbohydrates and more fat, whereas if we go over here, it's less fat and more carbohydrates. And what's interesting is those are the percentages of calories burned, but really when you look at it and evaluate it, your sprinter is burning just a ton of calories per hour. I mean, he's not going to sprint for an hour, but he's burning a ton of calories per hour, right, per kilogram of body weight. Whereas the person who is sitting on the couch is not burning as many calories, even though the predominance of his calorie burn is fat. So keep in mind, if you look at this like a pie chart, your pie for the anaerobic side is much bigger. Your pie on the aerobic side is much smaller, but the percentages are different, right? And you really have to look at this now and you take this another step further and you go, all right, so how is this going to help me with my clients? Well, you know, general adaptation syndrome, and we'll talk about the bell curve here in a couple sessions. You know, most of your clients and people are looking to burn fat and get into shape. And so you have to find a balance between how hard they work and what kind of calories you're burning. And you have this desired training response, so you have to apply a desired training stimulus or a stimulus to meet that desired training response to get the response you want. So really what it comes down to is you want to have, the biggest amount of pie, right? You want to burn the most calories per hour as possible, but you'd like to make that where you're burning at a high rate of fat. Well, you got to strike a balance somewhere in here. And as a trainer, the way I describe this to my clients and where I take them more often than not is this place that's referred to as anaerobic threshold. It is literally the transition of where your body goes from utilizing fat as an energy source to carbohydrates, or more accurately, glycogen as an energy source. And when I describe this to people, I usually describe it as, look, it is where, and you'll notice there's a difference when you hit that workload. Your body's going to basically change in terms of how hard you're breathing, how hard you're working, how long it takes to recover, and the workloads will be heavier for that. And where I describe this is, it's like, look, if you're wearing a heart rate monitor, you're at about 80% of a calculated heart rate max or better, right? And it's a person where when you're working out and training that person, you're either going to have the option, you're either going to need to talk or you're going to use your oxygen to work. So I always call it like oxygen allocation. And quite honestly, this place is not the most comfortable places to be in, but it gives you the best results. More specifically, when you get into like 400, 500 level courses, you have the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. If I can spit that out, it's where the oxygen itself can't be effectively carried through the blood. And then the other side of the equation is when you work out, yes, you want to suck in oxygen to offload it to the blood, to the muscles, and the muscles then load up CO2 to deliver back to the blood to go to the lungs to be able to blow off that CO2, that waste product. And you have this kind of balance where the blood lactate levels just get higher and higher, and you have to allow some recovery once in a while. So I often give this disclaimer to my clients when we're talking about this kind of utopia, where we're trying to find this happy place of burning the most calories at the highest level. It's not the nicest of places to be, but the results are great. It doesn't necessarily mean I got to beat the snot out of you. It's just that you got to understand you're going to be in an uncomfortable place, and that neighborhood that you're going to be in, if you will, that uncomfortable place for that workout is going to change from workout to workout, the fitter, put your fingers in quotes, you become. So realize what might seem like, and quite honestly was through evaluation, 80% of a max heart rate. Quite honestly, in a few weeks, it's going to take more than that to get you 80%. So that target's a little bit moving right now. As you get fitter and fitter and fitter, it ends up being where you can kind of predict what kind of workload you need to get to that 80% or better. At first, though, almost everything seems like 80% or better for somebody who's brand new. All right, so I'm going to jump on to strength versus power. So with strength versus power, you look at this in terms of work, right? And if you have conceptually, and I'm sure you've seen this before, if I ask you to push a boulder across the floor from point A to point B, that's work. If I ask you to take that boulder and push it up a hill, same boulder, same weight, same distance, but because you're pushing up against gravity, it's more work. Conversely, if I ask you to push the boulder downhill, gravity actually helps you with that work, and so it's less work. Now, power, on the other hand, if we use the same boulder, the same distance, and I now say, push that boulder in the shortest amount of time as possible, now we're incorporating power, because power is work divided by time. And this becomes important in several areas of sport application, specifically in runners, where you try to get them to go from a heel to toe foot strike position to more of like a ball to foot strike position. And so their contact patch is smaller. In essence, you're trying to get them to increase their workloads, be able to create more force, but then be able to apply that force into the ground into a smaller contact patch in a smaller amount of time. You're trying to progressively get them to spend less and less time on the ground to make them more poppy, more neurologically hot. Well, the goal is you're trying to do that to make them more powerful, and you're trying to get them to be able to create more power, apply more power into the ground, and then through proper technique and proper mechanics, trying to get the greatest amount of yield out of the ground, because there's slippage in there. There's some loss when you start talking about generating power, applying power, and getting power out of the ground. There is some yield and some loss in that process when trying to yield that out. So when you work with people in the power side of the continuum, realize that there's a technique component you really have to work on here. Not to say technique is not important here, because it sure is, but technique is hugely important over here in terms of being able to teach people how to get the most yield, most bang for their buck when they create power. So the boulder example, this is about as easy and straightforward as I can make it. You know, you push that boulder over a distance, you push the boulder uphill, same weight, same boulder, that's more work. Downhill, less work. If we ask you to incorporate time, that's more power oriented. And where it becomes important is if we look at these videos, you have a push press and a shoulder press, right? Both are shoulder-based exercise. One is more total body fitness and used as a progression of power clean. And is more explosive in nature. So you explode the weight up and you use the shoulders on the way down in the eccentric loading and the eccentric loading. Pop, down in control, pop. And you can kind of get an idea how quickly that bar accelerates up compared to the dumbbells over here. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. So you end up having between these two, this is a more power-oriented exercise. More power-oriented because it's explosive, but also more power-oriented because the hips are more actively involved. Whereas over here, because the person is seated, we take this musculature out of the equation. Everything from the upper body down is out. Another example of power versus strength would be hang cleans from the box. A lot of hip action, a lot of explosiveness, driving force into the ground, delivering that force up into the bar, and then catching the bar, whereas a leg press, yes, you could make this a faster repetition speed where you're popping that weight up and down, but in general, you have to be technically proficient and fast to do hang cleans correctly. Disclaimer, I'm not saying these are perfectly correct. Hip action, snap the bar up, pop. Where over here, this is a more slow, controlled tempo. I'm just going to fast forward. And also, the hips pretty much stay darn near stable. You do have some hip flexion in there as the weight is brought down, but it's certainly not the same hip action you have over here. So when you put this kind of all together on that continuum again, you have aerobic and anaerobic. You have anaerobic to the left, and go back to our pie chart, right? You're getting the most caloric burn on the carbohydrate side, least amount on the fat side, and here it's the reciprocal. You get more fat burn over here. And more sprint oriented over here, more power oriented on the left side, and more couch potato, you know, and aerobic in nature. But now here's the thing with your elite distance runners, they are literally working and bumping right along anaerobic threshold the entire time they're running that marathon. It is amazing to watch those people run. And they are able to actually run at anaerobic threshold. And part of getting comfortable with the anaerobic threshold is twofold, right? You have to condition yourself for it, and you also have to be accustomed to working there. It is uncomfortable to work in that environment. Your legs burn, your lungs are burning, you have to blow off CO2 as part of the process. You're trying to like oxygenate your blood, and it is not easy. These guys are unbelievably impressive in how they can continually ride that curve between aerobic and anaerobic and even dip into anaerobic and do so over the course of 26.6. Olympic weightlifting, it is they are in, they're on the platform, they get up, they grab the bar, they hoist it, boom, explosive, boom, dump the weight. That is it. Very short amount of time on the platform. So you look at these and you kind of go, okay, here's my continuum from strength versus power and aerobic versus anaerobic. They kind of tie together. And I think in this presentation, instead of breaking them out, it was a pretty good idea to put them together so you can compare them side by side. Now, what we'll do is we're going to jump from this video over to legs for the virtual lab part of the presentation. Signing off.